Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and as much as I love covering stories like X-Men and Judgment Day and things like that, a lot of those stories can be a little bit darker. So what I wanted to do here is I wanted to cover some Spider-Man stuff, because while there are some crazy things that happen in the Spider-Man stories, Spider-Man is by and large lighthearted, and it's always just a fun read. So this is the official start of Nick Spencer's run with Spider-Man Back to Basics. This comes off the heels of Dan Slott's run, which we have finished. We do have that, and you'll find a link to that series in the description to that whole playlist. What this does here is it's essentially a kind of Spider-Man reboot to a degree, in the sense that Peter Parker is just kind of going back to just being the normal Peter Parker, right? He's not like the CEO of Parker Industries. He's not ultra rich or anything like that. Of course, the run of Dan Slott basically solidifies how it was that he basically lost everything. But with Peter Parker back to his normal life, of course, it's him and it's Randy Robertson who are trying to find an apartment together. Now, Randy Robertson has been around for a very, very long time, and he's the son of Robbie Robertson, who's basically the guy that runs the Daily Bugle now. Now, for those of you guys who don't know who he is, because Robbie Robertson hasn't really appeared all that often in the Spider-Man mythos, he's kind of, at least he was for a long time, the second in command to J. Jonah Jameson. But following J. Jonah Jameson's seeming departure, now it's basically Robbie Robertson who runs the show. And so with Randy and Peter being friends for a long time, it's them kind of doing their thing. But as they're hunting around for a new apartment, suddenly they're met by the arrival of like Boomerang and Electro, at least the new Electro, Francine, and then like Rhino and Big Wheel, and it's small time, right? These are not great big huge things. And while it is easy to look at that and kind of consider it to be silly, it's sort of a hallmark of the Spider-Man comics. That is one of these situations where you get characters, you get villains that aren't like massive players in the realm of comic books, but it's always just kind of fun to see them. And they are, by all standards of measurement, the new Sinister Six, so to speak. Now, of course, Peter ends up taking off because, of course, he tells Randy, like, I got to take pictures for the Daily Bugle. Of course, him being Spider-Man, he leaps into action. And of course, it's one of these cool things because he's able to overpower these guys pretty readily, but it's also a fun little moment here. For years and years and years in Marvel Comics, the reason why I say this, for years in Marvel Comics, it was one of these things where we didn't really know why Peter cracked jokes outside of the fact that it was just kind of the lighthearted nature of his comics. The reason why Peter tells jokes is because it tricks his enemies into thinking he's not taking them seriously. And because they don't think he's taking them seriously, they get irritated, they get angry, and then their ability to focus begins to diminish. And so it makes it easier to defeat them. Now, it's also the other part of it that it keeps the Spider-Man stories entertaining. But one of the things that Peter does when he hits on this is when Rhino says like he can't take all of us at once. Peter cracks a joke and is kind of like, I'm not really taking you guys that seriously, but in reality he is, right? And he's like, Rhino's right, like there's just too many of them. I have to basically find a way to thin these numbers, even if it only offers a momentary distraction. And so of course he does, and he's able to basically defeat all these guys, only for the Kingpin Wilson Fisk to show up. Now, the Kingpin has traditionally been a villain in Marvel Comics, and he still is. But one of the things that we had talked about in recent years is that after the events of Secret Empire, when Captain America had basically had his history modified using a cosmic cube to turn him into a villain, that during that storyline, you basically had the city of New York that was encased in dark force energy. What it did is it basically trapped everybody in the city of New York, all the different heroes who were there. It removed them from being a threat to Captain America, but you had Kingpin, who was actually traveling around and keeping people safe from street level criminals, because the other heroes who were there were trying to do things like ensure that they could try to find a way to escape, but they weren't really focusing on the little guy. Kingpin, however, was doing that. And so because people in the city of New York started to see him as a champion of the people, when everything went back to normal at the end of Secret Empire, Wilson Fisk ran for mayor and won. And that's how he ended up having the position he's in now. Now, of course, this does take place before the events of Devil's Reign, just so you guys know. So Devil's Reign hasn't really happened yet, but it's Kingpin basically finding ways to expand his criminal influence using the legal route to do it, right? Using his position as the mayor to pull that off. And of course, we saw that come to fruition with the Devil's Reign storyline, for those of you guys who were curious. But the thing about this is that Boomerang just takes off, right? They have all these little boomerangs that belong to him and stuff like that. And he's like, well, you guys are forgetting one. And they're like, what's that? And he's like, the Jetarang. And then like, he just takes off and he leads the other criminals to their fate. And Peter's like, yep, that's kind of what Boomerang does, guys. He'll leave you hanging. Like, he'll literally bail on you. And so once Peter gets back to Randy ended up finding a 3-bedroom apartment that the two of them could rent, which is in a pretty great location, right? It's got a skylight. I mean, it's nice. It's a really, really nice apartment, or at least as nice as they can get. But when the question is asked by Peter, well, who in the hell is going to be renting the 3rd room? We end up finding out that it's actually Boomerang. So Peter's basically sharing an apartment with a criminal. Now, this is not an overly important part of this story, right? It's not huge here. I just wanted to cover this because I think that it basically sets the stage for the look and the feel of the Spider-Man stories. Of course, things will get serious here in a little bit, but of course, basically Boomerang's a crappy roommate, right? The guy just leaves stuff all over the place. He's lazy. He tells a story about him basically being caught by Peter, but he flips the script in terms of him being caught by Spider-Man and saying like, well, I'm the one that got him, and Spider-Man admires me, and all those different things, and of course, making it look like he's more of a hero than he is. But while all this is going on, one of the things to know is the story's kind of told in hindsight to a degree, because at the moment, Peter is alongside the Avengers facing off against all these aliens that just kind of seem to keep coming and coming and coming, right? Showing up over and over and over again. But one of the big things that also happens here, because that alien invasion will be important here in a second, one of the big things that happens here is that Peter is basically brought before a kind of ESU event, right? Brand New Day, which is kind of a play on the Spider-Man Brand New Day idea. But what they do is they're basically releasing a piece of software that has the ability to scan the documents of anybody who submits work and then determine whether or not it is a fraudulent work, right? Whether or not they had committed plagiarism. And so what ends up happening is the works of Peter Parker are brought before the piece of software, and Peter Parker, being considered one of the most celebrated students, his work is analyzed and it turns out to be fraudulent. Now, here's the reason why this happens, and it's a great throwback, right? It was written by Otto Octavius when he was the Superior Spider-Man, when Doctor Octopus had taken over the body and the mind of Peter Parker and then operated as Spider-Man. Because Otto Octavius was quote unquote technically the one who wrote this, it's technically not Peter Parker's work, which means Peter Parker has now been found guilty of plagiarism. It's a cool thing because one of the things to know, while this kind of seems to come out of nowhere, I mean, literally, he gets canned from his job, all that kind of stuff, right? He's talking to Mary Jane Watson, trying to figure out what he's gonna do. He's being chastised by Aunt May, which is really the worst of it, right? Where she's one of those things where she's like, I'm not angry, I'm just disappointed. You know what I mean? Like when a parent does that and you're just like, damn. It just crushes your soul. The reason why this is such a funny thing here is because it's the Parker look. For those of you guys who are not familiar with Spider-Man, there was a time towards the end of Dan Slott's run going into like Parker Industries. It's one of the reasons why people didn't seem to latch onto that story too much, where Peter was like a billionaire and everything was going great in his life. That historically speaking, Peter has the Parker luck. So just when things are going great, something's gonna happen that's gonna screw it all up, right? Sometimes it's a mistake that Peter makes. Sometimes it's because just a villain shows up and it keeps him, or it forces him to miss a date with Mary Jane Watson. It's just any number of things, right? He just can't quite seem to get things to go his way all the time. And so it's a really great way to kind of hit into that, right? To say like the things that have happened with Peter over the course of his life, even if they weren't necessarily his fault, are coming back to haunt him now. And so what ends up happening is kind of jumping back to this major fight that's going on here, right? With all these aliens and stuff. Peter takes this risk, right? He makes this kind of gamble where he leaps to the source of where these aliens seem to be coming from. And when he gets there, he literally finds just a giant dome, and inside is Mysterio. This whole thing is just a ruse by Quentin Beck. It's a trick, and it's written in like the most classic Spider-Man way ever, right? Like 1960s, 1970s Spider-Man, where he's like, these fools believe that they are under attack from another world. Little do they know, it is I, Mysterio, who has engineered their greatest defeat. It's designed to be a little hokey and kind of a throwback to the old school Spider-Man stories. And so of course, you basically end up having Quentin Beck who's defeated, and the Avengers realize it was all just basically an illusion, and they all kind of go back to doing their thing. But the truth about this, and this is where the story really begins to get interesting, is you have Peter who is basically talking to Mary Jane Watson and saying, look, like I almost died tonight, right? And I get that happens a lot, right? More than I would be willing to admit. And the truth is, if I'm being honest, nothing has felt right for a long time. And I think I know why. We've been through so much together. We've survived so much together. And I know that on my end, at least, if you hadn't been there, I would not have survived it. It's because of you, thinking about you, having a life with you, that it keeps me going and it makes it easier for me to survive these just, almost life destructive things, these circumstances that I end up in, only for us to find out that with him talking to Mary Jane Watson, the two of them basically end up making out. Now, this is a huge deal when it comes to the Spider-Man mythos. And the reason why is because ever since the events of Spider-Man One More Day, the idea of Peter Parker and Mary Jane Watson getting back together has always been something that Marvel's sort of been a little cloak and dagger about, right? Like, will they, won't they? And different writers, including Dan Slott, have kind of teased it like, will they get back together? And it's just enough of a tease to make you believe they will, but they ultimately never did. This seems to be the story where they're getting back together again. So for traditional Spider-Man fans, it's the long-awaited reunion, right? The long-awaited reinstatement of a relationship that, in their eyes, never really should have ended in the first place. Now, the kicker to all this, and this is where we really start to get into the meat and potatoes of this, is where Mysterio is basically being put on trial for his actions. And then you essentially have Janice Lincoln who shows up. Now, Janice Lincoln is not a major player here. She's the daughter of Tombstone. Just kind of a quick little explanation. Alonzo Lincoln was just a guy who I mean, he's a criminal. He's by no means a major player, but he's still a criminal nonetheless. His daughter Janice was enamored with his criminal life, always wanted to become a part of that life. So when the opportunity presented itself, she became the Beetle, which again is a small-time villain, and then basically became a criminal in her own right. For reasons that we'll find out here in a second, with her having a history in law and having been involved in law for quite some time, she shows up here to initially represent Quentin Beck, who basically shoots it down. And of course, she presents the idea that no, I'm representing Quentin Beck, and he pleads not guilty for reasons of insanity. But where he shoots that down and says, no, that's ridiculous, suddenly she starts puking up all these insects, rats start appearing out of nowhere, the entire room begins to crumble and fall apart, and then a disembodied voice comes out of nowhere and it's just like, Quentin, like, you should know better than to try to run away from me, man. Like, you should know you can't run from me that way. Only for us to find out that it's just a person who's there, right? Now, this being does actually have a name, right? Their name is Kindred, and we'll learn about them over the course of this run. If you want to, you can spoil it for yourself, but I would highly advise you don't do that, because the progress to learning about this character is phenomenal, right? It's just one of the best parts of the Spider-Man run that Nick Spencer had wrote. But basically, it's one of these things where there seems to have been an agreement that was worked out between Kindred and Mysterio, where Kindred would give Mysterio the means by which he could participate in his part of the plan that Kindred had set up, which we don't really know what it is, to be honest, not at this moment anyway, but that Mysterio had basically defected from that plan when he blew off Janice Lincoln. Now, the thing about this is Kindred's response is like, if I didn't really think you could be a part of this plan, if you didn't matter to me, you'd be dead. I never would have gotten a hold of Janice, and I never would have sent her over to you in order to ensure that you could basically get off for your crimes. But you turned down my offer, right? You turned down this whole thing. And so quite literally, Quentin Beck is begging for his life, which indicates that Kindred has the ability to kill this guy. Now, there are some statements that are made, which is like, I brought you back from hell, I can send you back, different things along those lines, which gives us some small clues into who Kindred is. But playing this for what it is and just kind of rolling with it as a new story, right? Just kind of keeping that suspension of disbelief, not really spoiling anything, it really presents a lot of mystery there. And so one of the crazy things that happens is that where Kindred says, okay, fine, like, I will give you another chance, you had better not fail me, that Quentin Beck begging for his life is all basically shown to be an illusion by Kindred. None of it seems to have actually happened in terms of a real and tangible life. But what it does is it gives the perception that Quentin Beck is really going insane. I mean, literally, he's acted out all of this in front of the court. They really think he's crazy. And even Janice doesn't seem to know what's going on, because she's like, damn, that was one hell of a show, And so he ultimately accepts her offer, but that's where you kind of get the explanation. Something much bigger is going on here. Now, following this, things kind of move relatively quickly, right? For example, Peter Parker, having been busted for plagiarism, has to retake the class that he had initially plagiarized. Of course, his instructor is basically the Lizard, right? So that's a really cool thing. You get Doc Connors, who basically comes back. But what Doc Connors is working on as part of his own version of what's really Horizon Labs, right? Just some of the smartest people just essentially working together, albeit in a classroom setting, is they're working on the genome, right? And in fact, they're actually working on a genome isolation unit, kind of an isotope generator. But what this does is it creates a really interesting situation where seemingly out of nowhere, Taskmaster and Black Ant show up for the purpose of like stealing this thing, right? Like literally snatching it up and running off with it, right? So this isotope accelerator, we don't know exactly what it'll do, but essentially it'll modify the human genome. A great big huge fight breaks out between all of them. Of course, Peter Parker creates a distraction by kind of detonating these fumes all over the place, which allows him him to become Spider-Man. He faces off against these guys, he basically fights them, defeats them, and is ultimately blasted by the device when it's inadvertently activated. And when that happens, he actually ends up separating Peter Parker from Spider-Man. So they're basically two separate people. And things get really cool here, because what ends up happening is that while Peter Parker sort of enjoys his life and Spider-Man goes out and fights crime, there is a little bit of a discussion there between the two of them, right? Like, how exactly do we cope with this? How do we deal with this, right? I mean, there's, you know, how does this life work, right? I mean, you are Spider-Man, I'm Peter Parker, so do you just be Spider-Man and I just live the life of Peter Parker and you just kind of go forward from there? But the other part of this is that they are identical, right? So they think exactly the same way. What one does, the other would do. And so what it does is it allows Peter Parker to enjoy his own life with himself, with Mary Jane Watson and his friends and so on. And it allows Spider-Man to go forward and basically be a superhero in New York. It's really what Peter Parker always wanted in a lot of different ways. The big problem with this comes to a head when you see the re-emergence of the Tri-Sentinel. Now, the Tri-Sentinel is old school, right? It's an old school thing. So this goes all the way back to the days of like Project Wide Awake and Acts of Vengeance and all that kind of stuff. In effect, what you had here is a guy named Sebastian Shaw, who you've heard of if we're covering the X-Men comics. He has something called Shaw Industries. Sebastian Shaw was part of a group called the Hellfire Club, which basically existed to influence the world and to make sure that their schemes or desires always came to fruition, but above all else, to make sure they always come out on top, right? They're never really persecuted or anything along those lines. And so Sebastian Shaw, being a part of the Hellfire Club, with that being its charter, had basically helped the federal government with Project Wide Awake by essentially creating three prototype Sentinels that would be the forerunner for what would eventually become Nimrod. But during Loki's Acts of Vengeance storyline, when Loki united all the different villains together to fight the different heroes, that Loki had merged the three Sentinels together and then in turn created the Tri-Sentinel, which was just following the rhyme and reason of Loki, which was to destroy superheroes. Ultimately, Spider-Man, when he had the power of Captain Universe, defeated Tri-Sentinel, and that was seemingly the end of that. But for a reason that hasn't necessarily been explained, the Tri-Sentinel has returned. Now, of course, Spider-Man shows up here and is basically able to attack the Tri-Sentinel and basically start to bring it down. But that's when Peter starts to notice huge differences. That where Spider-Man had been going forward and fighting guys like Adrian Toomes, right, Vulture, and then just beating him up, and in this instance, with the Tri-Sentinel, what it does is it shows that Spider-Man doesn't really seem to have any regard for collateral damage. All it really cares about is just defeating guys, being reckless, different things along those lines. It creates problems. And in fact, when he goes to visit Doc Connors, one of the things Connor says is, yes, I mean, Peter doesn't say like, oh my God, this is what seems to be happening, but Kirk Connors is talking to him about these are the kind of issues that we run into here. That the further these two rats, for example, that were experimented on using this accelerator, the further they are away from each other, or the longer they're away from each other, kind of separated basically, the more decreased their mental faculties become. They basically become dumber, right? They get dumber and dumber and dumber as time goes on until they reach whatever conclusion this happens to be, which they don't really know what it is. But the important thing here is that it's illustrating that Peter himself will experience diminished intelligence alongside Spider-Man, and the consequences could be even more worse than that. The other part of this is we basically end up switching over to the person that is the logic behind why this Tri-Sentinel is attacking, which is Mendel Stromm. Now, Mendel Stromm, again, this is why the story is called Back to Basics, because it's essentially Nick Spencer giving us a tour of these classic Spider-Man villains that honestly we hadn't really seen or heard from for quite some time. Mendel Stromm was initially one half of Osborn Industries, right? That he and Norman Osborn had worked together for quite some time. And in fact, Mendel Stromm was the one who was responsible for the creation of the Goblin Serum that ultimately Norman Osborn took and then became the Green Goblin. But the way that things initially played out is that essentially Norman Osborn had forced Mendel Stromm out of Osborn Industries. Now, that'll basically be a retold origin or a retold story involving his character, which we'll find out later on in the Spider-Man run of Nick Spencer himself. The thing about this though is that because he had basically been forced out, that Mendel Stromm had always harbored a vendetta against Norman Osborn. He'd always hated him and he always wanted to get his revenge on Norman. But with Norman basically being out of the picture now, Mendel Stromm saw this as being his time. But yet again, he's running into frustration by Spider-Man, who's not only seized control of the Tri-Sentinel, but actually re-spray painted its face to make it look like Spider-Man, which is kind of cool when you think about it. It's pretty awesome when you look at that. But that's kind of the issue that's being ran into here, is that what you're seeing is that Peter Parker is kind of the conscience of Spider-Man, and that with Spider-Man operating without the conscience of Peter Parker, that Spider-Man is more reckless. He doesn't really care about the collateral damage or the people that are hurt. It's more about just having fun. The other part of this is that you end up having Peter who goes back and visits Kirk Connors only to find out that both rats have died. And that's the consequence here, that as long as Peter Parker and Spider-Man, as long as they stay apart, and the longer they stay apart, they will inevitably die. And so things will just get progressively worse, right? They will lose their mental faculties, that Spider-Man will become progressively reckless, right? That his actions will lead to the deaths of more and more people, and it'll essentially, ultimately end in the two of them dying. And so in order to prevent the massive loss of life that Spider-Man could inflict, as well as just ensuring his own survival, the mission of Peter is to grab Spider-Man and to force them to basically reunite using the genome accelerator, and then bring them back into a singular person. But the other part of this is that for Mendel Stromm, he's plagued by his failure at the hands of Spider-Man and sees himself as yet a person who's just continued to fail along this task of trying to basically, reinsert himself back to glory, or however it is that you want to describe it. The issue here is that he's basically visited by Kindred. And what Kindred does is that while Kindred does not necessarily appear per se, Kindred basically makes a deal with Mendel Stromm, that if Mendel Stromm will work for him and will ensure his campaign, right, destroying Spider-Man, so on and so forth, that he will give Mendel Stromm an army of Tri-Sentinels, which he does, right? Mendel Stromm is granted all these Tri-Sentinels. One, just to give you guys perspective, one was difficult for Spider-Man to defeat. An army of them is damn near impossible. And so what ends up happening is you basically pick up with Mendel Stromm launching a campaign against the city of New York, basically trying to destroy Peter Parker and basically everybody there. The problem with the deal that Mendel Stromm made is he was so obsessed with basically gaining the Tri-Sentinels and achieving his goal of basically overcoming, or really kind of elevating himself to a higher state. He never considered the full totality of the deal that he was making, which is his life. His life is now forfeit. And so he's literally destroyed by the forces of Kindred. Now, this will become an important factor later on down the line. In fact, it'll become stupendously important. So while it seems to come out of nowhere and doesn't seem to serve a purpose, I do want you to keep it in the back of your mind as we get further and further into Nick Spencer's run. But beyond that, you have Peter and you have Spider-Man who are literally fleeing for their lives from this Tri-Sentinel that's hunting them down, but the Sentinel launches an attack. But in the attack, Peter Parker is severely injured, and Spider-Man, realizing the significance of this, and Peter Parker talking to him saying that, hey, at least I got to go out, trying to save people one last time, and so on and so forth, and basically kind of offering himself up as not really a martyr, but somebody who has quote unquote made the ultimate sacrifice. That what it does is it leads to Spider-Man basically seeing like, okay, maybe there is some kind of a thing here, and Peter Parker tries to push on that, right? Tries to nudge that, and he says, but maybe this is what you needed to have happen to finally understand that with great power there must also come great responsibility, that these things can be prevented, and we can prevent things like this from happening in the future if we reunite, if we come back together. And the response of Spider-Man is, yeah, no, I'm good, man. I'm doing my thing. I'm gonna keep on having fun doing my thing. And Peter's like, well, it was worth it. So like, because he has him in position, he basically fires off the machine, which basically was designed, like located in this exact spot. Peter had essentially led Spider-Man here, basically, in order to ensure this happened. It basically fires on the two of them and then reunites them back together again, which of course restores Peter Parker's conscience back to the body of Spider-Man. And the two of them kind of go forward and do their thing, right? They ultimately at least try to fight one of the Tri-Sentinels, but it really doesn't seem to work, and the other Tri-Sentinels basically end up flying back into Mendel Stromm. And then of course the entire building explodes once Peter Parker gets to Mendel Stromm and realizes something else was going on here, that somebody had done this to Mendel Stromm, that there's something seemingly taking place that Peter's not fully aware of. But it's one of those cool things, because what you end up having is you kind of switch back to Taskmaster and you switch back to Black Ant, and you end up finding out that them basically stealing that isotope generator, right? That whole ruse there. It was never actually about stealing that device. That was never the point here. It was never really to do that. They had no intention of actually stealing it. Them being there and initiating that entire conflict, that was done at the behest of Kindred. The Kindred plays a very particular game. And so what Kindred seems to have been doing is orchestrating things in such a way to where Peter Parker was temporarily broken and then essentially reinstated. What the purpose of that is, we'll see, at a future point in time. But again, like, it's the basis behind this first story is to establish that Kindred's the one basically behind the scenes running the show. It's a big time deal. It's a pretty cool situation. And so what we're gonna do in the next video that we do, we're actually gonna pick up with Kraven the Hunter, which is gonna be a really, really cool story arc and one that I'm exceedingly excited about. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.